Hello and welcome to Into the Abyss podcast. My name is Todd Decker. I have a couple guests here with me today to have some interesting conversation. We have Jared and Jack. Guys, welcome back. Happy to have you.
Thank you.
Good to be back.
So today we're going to be talking about personality. And this was a topic that I thought would be fun to get into because I saw that there was some discussion in the online forum that we participate in and stuff that you guys have gotten into before and researched. And I've gotten into it a little bit recently, just based on your conversations. So I'm ready to hear all of your insights and learn all about it. In particular, what we're going to get into are different ways of studying personality, characterizing it, and some of the, I'm not sure what the right word would be, but metrics or systems that are used to characterize it. So would one of you like to kind of give an overview of what some of the different ways are out there? And I mean, we could, for fun, we could get into like the Harry Potter schools of personalities as well if you want. I don't know anything about that, but I'm thinking more like I guess the academic or professional methods. Either of you want to take that?
Sure, I can do that.
All right.
Yeah, and with the caveat that like I've studied personality, but it's not really my specialty.
Oh, we need to cut this short right now. I can't have that. No, go ahead. You're fine.
Yes. So there's many ways to think about personality. One is like there's the behavioral view, which is just behavior is kind of like personality is what you do. There's certain behaviors that you're more likely to do, and that's the way to understand personality. It's just a tendency to do certain behaviors, which you can measure by actually measuring those behaviors. Most people, I think, tend to think about it a little bit differently, which is like something kind of like, even if you don't do those behaviors, you still have kind of an essence, something that is you, that you are that like inclined to do, regardless of whether you do it or not. And like, that's one way of thinking about personality. Another dimension that you might care about is something like how, like, is it like how, like nature versus nurture? Is it something that you were born with? Is it something that you develop? And there's all of these different views for personality from that angle. More relevant to the conversation that I think we're going to have is, given that we just kind of accept that personality is just a tendency to be a certain way, how do you actually represent that? How do you actually quantify that? What's the model? How do you actually model it? And the way that researchers have tended to model personality is with the Big Five model. The Big Five model, basically what they did is they took, I can't remember if it was the English dictionary or the German dictionary, but they took every adjective out of the dictionary. So things like funny, kind, smart, nice, all these things that you could use to describe a person, and tested people across all these dimensions and just like basically asked, like, are you smart? Are you kind? Are you nice? All these things. And then they ran a factor analysis. And what a factor analysis does is it says, oh, here's like all of these traits, like kind and nice, like those are highly correlated. If you say you're nice, you're also very likely to be kind. And they just kept doing that, which is kind of like standard survey methodology, until they wound up finding that there was kind of like 5 superclusters that described all of the adjectives. Like all of the adjectives in the dictionary ended up in one of these 5 categories. And that's the Big Five. So I'll just list the 5. The way to remember it is ocean, OCEAN. O for openness to experience, C for conscientiousness, E for extroversion, A for agreeableness, N for neuroticism. And what you do is people tend to take a survey and you just kind of measure how they do across these 5 dimensions. And that is supposed to explain or help you predict behavior over time and across situations.
Yeah. So something that stands out to me about that is that the approach is very empirical, right? It's not so much theoretical from the start, like, okay, how should we think about personality, and then what would be the best way to break it down? Uh, I mean, you're really starting from a huge pool of descriptors, like you said with the dictionary, and then seeing what comes out of it. Uh, and I don't know if anyone would have expected those five in particular. I hadn't thought about that, but I guess they just kind of followed what the analysis led to, right? That those were the things that popped up.
It is very strange that that is the methodology that ended up being the staple for how to measure personality. Lots of people before the Big Five, I don't know who actually developed the Big Five. Maybe that's something I should know. But lots of people, Jung, Freud, lots of people tried to come up with different theories of personality. And they kind of just stated, like, I think people are kind of like this, and the other people are different in this way. And they kind of just theoretically came up with it. And there wasn't a lot of empirical research behind that. And Big Five is interesting because, yeah, it just starts with the dictionary because, hey, personality has to be essentially that set of things if it's going to be anything at all. Because adjectives are all relative. And so if we're talking about personality, it's how we're different from each other, how, like, relative to each other, how we're different, not what we have in common, but what we have different. And then, yeah, factor analysis, that's the methodology for approaching this. And that's like the mainstay in research. If you're doing personality research, you're using Big Five. There are other models of personality. Most of them are not super popular among academics and researchers. They tend to dismiss them out of hand, sometimes even aggressively dismiss them, calling them pseudoscience, calling them unreliable, invalid, and every other name in the book to make it seem like this is based, like every other personality test is just astrology and
Right.
has no validity whatsoever.
Or worse than astrology in the case of one of your very bold professors.
Yes.
So, okay, well, let's go ahead and bring up the other big one. The Myers-Briggs, right? So what's the Myers-Briggs?
Sure. So the Myers-Briggs Type Inventory is a personality test that is probably the most popular mainstream personality test out there. You'll hear things like the Enneagram also, but like the Myers-Briggs is one that has made a lot of headway in corporate America, has made a lot of headway in schools, things like that, where sometimes on a job application, you'll be asked to take this personality test, and a lot of times it's the Myers-Briggs that they're doing. I mean, there are countless pop personality ones out there, but this one really seems to be the one that has captured people's attention the most. And what it is, it divides people. It has four major dimensions that it divides people along, and it checks whether people are high or low in any one of these dimensions and assigns them a different letter in each category based on whether they're high or low, and then goes through all four dimensions, and at the end gives you this four-letter code that says you are, say, an ESTJ or ENFP. And those four areas that it identifies are extroversion, introversion, then feeling, sensing, intuition, sensing, thinking, feeling, and perceiving, judging, which are really vague, really, really unclear terms. Like, you hear those, and other than introversion, extroversion, which is pretty straightforward, most people are going to hear those and not really be sure what exactly they're describing. So just to break them down really quickly, introversion, extroversion, pretty straightforward. The idea that they would put forth is basically, do you get energy from being with people more or from being on your own more? Where's your preference there? The intuition sensing one is basically asking, are you a things person or are you an ideas person? Their intuition one would be saying, how much do you gravitate towards the abstract? How much do you like talking about ideas, so forth? Whereas their people high on sensing, for them, they would say, oh yes, you're very grounded, you're practical, you're centered in this world, so forth. The thinking feeling is a little bit deceptive in its name, in my opinion. But what they're aiming to say is basically, how much are you going to take other people's emotions into account? How much do you prioritize emotion? So the stereotypical thinking would be, say, Ben Shapiro, facts don't care about your feelings. And the idea of feeling would be basically the reverse, that you do care about people's feelings, that you are attuned to emotion, and you take it into account in your conversation, so forth. And then perceiving judging would be essentially equivalent to conscientiousness in the big five. The question of how organized are you? How orderly are you? How goal-oriented are you? So forth. Where perceiving would be low conscientiousness. That is, you're very distractible. You're very, you potentially lack a goal focus. You're not very organized. Your desk is probably horribly messy. Whereas judging is the reverse in all of those. You're the sort of person who has a planner in front of you. You know exactly what you're going to do in a day, and you do it. You're organized. You're diligent, so forth. And that's how they would break up the dynamic for it. Anyway, so it's similar to the big five. After that, you just take a quiz, and then it reflects your answers back to you and says, here's what you are. Here's your personality. That's the MBTI in a nutshell.
Yeah. And I have a way of sometimes making analogies that aren't really helpful, that confuse more than elucidate. But and to take like an analogy from linear algebra, when you have a bunch of vectors in some type of space, you'll want to have a basis which defines the dimensions along which it will be set, right? So say we only had two dimensions, then we could project any vector on the x and y dimension. In a test like the big five, you have a basis of five dimensions that you can define it in. And the reason you would want to make a basis is to find things that are linearly independent, right? So like with the big five, what it makes me think of is basically they're trying to find what's independent, right? So you're saying, okay, all these things kind of clustered together here. These things clustered together here. These ones, like in between the clusters, kind of overlap, but for the most part, they're separated. So it makes sense to define things in terms of these five. And really, but it's a model, right? So it's not necessarily saying, okay, this is the way the brain is structured, that it has these five modules and that you just turn the dials, right? I don't think anyone would say that. But so it's still a model at the end of the day, and you're just trying to figure out, okay, what model gives the cleanest kind of characterization. Where really Myers-Briggs is doing something very similar, right? And it's one way I could kind of characterize a difference in how useful each one is how well do those dimensions, how independent are they, right? Like, and how much overlap is there between a trait along one dimension and a trait along another? But both are models, right? I mean, they're both, you're taking some personality space and trying to break it down with these models.
Yeah, I think both are trying to do the same thing. It says that personality is best represented by some number of dimensions, and let's use a survey to be able to identify how people land on those dimensions. The difference is that the dimensions that they've identified are different. I would argue that Myers-Briggs is incoherent in many ways. We'll see how Jack feels about that. And then the basis on how they were created originally is very different. Whereas Big Five started with this kind of empirical approach where it was a survey methodology, or the methodology they use is factor analysis in surveys, which is just this very standard way of doing that. And Myers-Briggs was, it's kind of based in Jung. Carl Jung, had some ideas about personality, but it's actually not his. It's actually two ladies, I think it was a mother and a daughter, many years later, kind of just were interested in Jung and decided, well, what if we kind of made a personality test like this? And they added some things, they took away some things. So it's not even really Jung, because Jung wouldn't have agreed with it because it's very different than his own model of personality. It was just these to women who just were kind of interested in Jung and just decided to do it. They didn't have any kind of academic background or anything like that. They just theorized that this is how people are. And for some reason, the one that has no empirical basis whatsoever is the one that people gravitate to in the public sphere and has taken over the consulting world.
Well, and it would be interesting. I do want to talk about why that is, because that's an interesting question. Now, Jack, you had shared an article. I pulled that up just a little bit ago about kind of overlap between, as I understand it, overlap between Myers-Briggs and the Big Five.
Yes.
You want to talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So before I get into that, though, I want to lead with essentially my thesis for why the field of personality psychology gets so protective around the Big Five and so upset about the Myers-Briggs.
Yeah, actually, you know what I was thinking is a few of my episodes have gotten into different wars, right? So we've had the statistics wars, and what was it? I thought there was another one, so this is like the personality wars. I don't know if anyone has called it that, but it seems to have very many attributes to like the science wars and the statistics wars, where people in and outside of academia on these have very strong opinions.
Yes. And in this case, very frankly, I think it's a case of the lady doth protest too much. That is, I think they want to be, as a social science, they want to be seen as having similar rigor to the hard sciences, and they want to be seen as doing something dramatically distinct from every random Joe on the street who says, yeah, I know how people work. You know, you have this person who's this way, you have this person who's this way. They want to look and say, no, we have taken a thorough, objective, scientific approach to this problem that should be taken seriously, and we should be seen as distinct from all of these charlatans. What makes it very uncomfortable for them is that, quite frankly, the work of all those charlatans ends up being incredibly similar to their own work if you look at just the results and not the process they use to get there. So you take the MBTI compared to the Big Five, every axis of the MBTI correlates very strongly and very distinctly with a single axis of the Big Five. That is, one way or another, they seem to have nailed 4 out of the 5 same traits, with some mistakes, to be clear. There are some losses. It's not perfect, but you can say very clearly that the introversion-extroversion scale is very similar to the introversion scale on the Big Five, the extroversion scale on the Big Five.
That kind of makes sense.
The sensing-feeling scale, sensing intuition scale is very similar to openness to experience in the Big Five. The thinking feeling scale is correlated reasonably with agreeableness in the Big Five. And the perceiving judging scale is correlated quite strongly with conscientiousness in the Big Five. To the extent that if you have someone take the Big Five and then you divide it the same way the Myers-Briggs does on all of those domains, and I've done this. I've done a survey of several hundred people where I had them take both a Big Five test and a Myers-Briggs test. And then I divided the Big Five the same way with the Myers-Briggs, where I assigned the lower half one letter, the higher half the other letter. And then I see the results. They look almost identical. You'll see the biggest shift basically is that a lot of people who want to say, oh, yes, I'm a thinking person, end up, when it becomes, oh, I'm disagreeable, they end up shifting more towards the agreeable direction. And so that's where you see the biggest shift, is that suddenly people are somehow less keen to identify with things when it'll lead them in a direction of sounding disagreeable versus when they're sounding thinking. And so you see a big shift there. But in the other axes, it's almost identical, where the data from one and the data from the other, person looking at one graph versus the other would basically not be able to distinguish them. The only thing that's really left off is neuroticism.
Okay, that's what I was going to ask, is what's left off, so neuroticism.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And in fact, a lot of newer editions of the MBTI, a lot of the more popular ones that you'll find online have started adding in a pseudo-neuroticism scale. So they've basically got that covered also.
Yes. So like let's see, I have I was just pulling up mine when I did it. It was an INFP and then a T, and I don't remember what that's for.
And it's like turbulent versus whatever.
Okay.
I don't remember exactly, but that T is there saying, Big Five is cool. Let's adopt this fifth axis also. And yeah.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That actually makes. I didn't compare the axes because I didn't know which ones were possibly corresponding to which ones. But just looking at it real quick, it seems like it corresponds.
Yeah. Actually, that could be a fun place to go. Yeah, so, what are your Big Five traits? Yeah. And what was that MBTI result?
Sure. I'll go ahead and share. So I'll do Big Five first. So I'm actually above 50 on all of them. Not too high on the neuroticism one, but it was slightly. So 54 on negative emotionality, as I called it, which I guess would be neuroticism.
And these are percentiles, by the way. So you're in the 54th percentile.
Oh, okay. I didn't know that. Okay.
I believe if it was the 538 one, I believe it's not actually percentiles, but yeah, I got tripped up on that one. But anyway, regardless,
should be normalized, so it's at least pretty close to
yes,
like what it is to the population.
It should be fairly close
because the numbers should be kind of meaningless unless it's in percentile, because it's not trying to quantify like absolute levels of conscientiousness. Right. It's trying to quantify how much more conscientious are you than the average person in the population.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. And actually, that's one of the things I mentioned to you guys. I was listening to that course on personality. It was talking about relative measurement versus absolute measurement, that you really can only do relative measurement with these type of things, which makes sense. Anyway, I was very high on the openness and agreeableness, like in the 90s. And then conscientiousness in the 60s. And then actually slightly extroverted. So in the 50s and the negative and extroversion. So that's my Big Five. And then going to Myers-Briggs. So I was, you'll have to help me remember which was which. But so on introverted, I was in the 60s, intuitive in the 70s, feeling in the 80s, prospecting in the 50s, and turbulent in the 50s.
Right. So you ended up as an ENFPT for the
an INFPT.
Oh, INFPT. Right.
So yeah, I meant introverted. Sorry, 60s on the introverted. So I guess it was flipped on the introverted extroverted. But.
Yeah, and if you look at the specific numbers with that, basically that shouldn't be all that surprising in either case. So the two ones where you have a very clear, distinct preference, where you're clearly apart from average,
right?
That is on your openness and your agreeableness. Whatever test you'll take, whether it's one of those, it'll show you unambiguously, yes, you
and
are.
What were those again? So yes, intuitive and feeling.
Intuitive and feeling. So yes.
Okay. Yeah, basically, and those are the ones where I was. Yeah.
No matter how many times you took either test, no matter how what mood you were in, so forth, you would pretty much expect to get that N and that F in Myers-Briggs anytime.
Okay.
Whereas conscientiousness, negative emotionality, and extroversion, you're towards the middle in all of those. This is where the Myers-Briggs really falls short in its presentation, is you're towards the middle. It has to assign you one of the poles as the letter. So It's just like, sure, we'll say you're extroverted. And yeah. So from your Big Five results to your MBTI results, there's very little difference in a practical sense.
Yeah, that's interesting to see that breakdown. Now, just a quick thing. Since we're on three people here, we'll have to restart, but that's no problem.
Yes.
Okay.
So there's three things that I think we need to address. The first is why academics react so strongly to Myers-Briggs and prefer Big Five. Second is, why do the general populace prefer Myers-Briggs to the Big Five, despite researcher preference. And then Jack and I are both INTPs, I believe. Is that correct?
Yes.
And there's a whole debate around that we need to get into.
So
what a coincidence that two people who are so very similar would, on this test that is no better than astrology, and in fact even worse than astrology, that they would happen to score the same on it. Like, who really? The test is garbage, so it would be absurd to predict that would happen, and yet,
yeah,
bizarrely it happened. Like,
okay, so let's start with the researcher criticism, because Jack and I would probably also both be Ravenclaws. Are you a Ravenclaw?
I am.
If we took a which Pokemon are you quiz, we'd probably both be Mewtwo. If we took a which animal are you, we'd probably both be owls.
Actually, I just took the dope bird test. And I was an owl for the dope bird test.
I feel unprepared. I haven't taken these other tests. I need to go do them.
I'm making them up because me and Jack are similar in a very, I know the ways in which we are similar. And that dimension is going to be, it's essentially, we're very high in openness to experience. And we enjoy intellectual debate. And so whatever personality quiz we're going to take, we're going to be in the category that's like, hey, what's the type of personality that does intellectual debate? Yes, Jack and Jared, you fit in that category. And I don't think that makes every possible personality test that has a dimension that is like, this is the type of person that does intellectual debate. I don't think that makes it valid. Astrology is also going to have that, right? You're going to have, there's going to be certain like archetypes of personality that any personality test is going to grab. So I don't think that us being the same personality, INTP, makes Myers-Briggs particularly more powerful than any other random quiz you could find online.
I do have to cut in on the astrology one, and then I'll pass it back to you, which is, I think it's absurd to say astrology also has some intellectual thing, because no, the way astrology assigns who is in which group is a way that should not have any correlation to those actual traits. That is, which month you are born in. And the way all of these quizzes assign it is the exact same the Big Five assigns it, which is you answer a bunch of questions and then it reflects your answers back to you. So it's not at all accurate to bring astrology in as an example there. If someone did make an astrology quiz that had you say, okay, which astrology sign are you? And didn't ask birth months, but then took the signs, took their personalities, and then said, okay, well, make a bunch of questions that assign you a thing, then yes, I think it would start looking a lot more similar to these other quizzes. But that's not what astrology is. And when people bring astrology in as a comparison, it's a absurd and an unfair comparison for precisely that reason. It's just not valid.
So that's very interesting, Jack, that the theory is important, not just the data, because that's what I think you're doing with Myers-Briggs, right? What you're saying is the theory doesn't matter. If you actually just only look at the data, if you treat Myers-Briggs by only looking at how people actually score and you quantify that as, from 0 to 100, rather than looking at the categories, rather than looking at the shadow, whatever it is that Myers-Briggs has around shadow, like essentially the way that you've approached Myers-Briggs is to completely throw out the theory and focus entirely on the data. And I think that you've fundamentally changed the nature of Myers-Briggs. And I think that's part of where our disagreement comes down to, because if you look at the data and you don't treat Myers-Briggs as it's meant to be treated and is actually used in practice, sure, there is some correlations, but that's not how Myers-Briggs actually does things. They categorize people. They don't put them on scales of 0 to 100. They categorize you and say, hey, this is your person.
Like Todd, when he pulled up his test example, it does both.
Yes.
And you started with what felt like aimed at a gotcha, like you're caring about theory and data. No, with astrology, I'm caring about data. You look at the people who are Cancers, you say, what percent of them will have this personality type? It should be no higher than chance because they're arranged in a way that gives a chance result. You don't have to look at any sort of underlying theory for that. You just look at the data and say, what can you draw from this? With Myers-Briggs, the data and the categories even let you make very clear, testable predictions. And that aspect of testability is fundamental to any empirical approach.
I'm not familiar. What's the theory behind Myers-Briggs? You mentioned something about a shadow and all that. I don't know what that is.
It's not really worth getting into, I would say, just because
Is it
It's
essential to Myers-Briggs? Like, could it just be
it is
discarded
essential to understanding what Myers-Briggs is actually doing. It's essential to understanding what it was attempting to do, what it does do, and it's just total nonsense.
Is that true though? Because like I could use Myers-Briggs and I've never heard of any of that stuff.
Right.
Yeah.
I think Jared overplays this theory idea because, again, because he.
Say it, Jack. Say it.
No, because you want it to be you want to emphasize the ways in which it is invalid, and you don't want to give credit where credit is due, and then basically scooping the big five, and the big five basically being an iteration on the same thing. Yeah, I think you lean too much on it because that's where you can make a strong case of, yeah, they were just making this stuff up. They were. So what does it tell us? That people who are just making this stuff up got almost as far as people who dove into all the factor analysis and pulled out all the categories. What does it tell us? That people who just looked around at people and made judgments of, yeah, we feel like this is a theory that fits, got that close. And I think that's where it gets a lot more interesting.
So I'm actually fine with that. Like, I'm fine that lay people can look at the variety around them and kind of pick up on what personality dimensions actually exist. Like, sure, I think in some sense, like, that is possible and it does happen. But that's why I think that Myers-Briggs is basically just like a Pokemon personality test or an animal personality test. Or if astrology was more like, hey, which sign best represents you rather than which month you were born into. Like, I think all of these personality tests could be potentially just as valid as Myers-Briggs. So I'm fine that people can kind of pick up on what dimensions actually exist. It's a question of how much better is Big Five than Myers-Briggs. And I think in that sense, it is miles and miles superior.
Let's stop there and we'll restart the meeting and pick up on that point.
Let's do it.
All right, we're back. We had to pause there for a second for our Zoom meeting constraints. But so we were in the middle of a discussion on, I guess, the accuracy or the results of the Myers-Briggs versus the Big Five, and we were getting a good discussion going there. Even with my high agreeableness, even if it makes me a little uncomfortable, I'm sacrificing for the higher good. So let's get into it. We missed in the recording before I pressed record that Jared was actually apologizing to Jack here. So even with your what is it, thinking versus your disagreeableness, you still have a heart. So
I do rank high on agreeableness.
Do you? Okay.
Yes.
So that's why.
Yeah, but I don't know how much of that is nature versus nurture. I think I might actually be. I don't know. It's hard to know. It feels like it varies a lot on context, and that's actually another criticism of personality, that it's better at, like, Big Five, for example. It better captures consistency over time than it does capture consistency across situations.
Well, okay, so let me ask the question this way. So I think you had said something like that the accuracy or the results of the Big Five are far superior to basically the rest. And so I was just curious, how do you know that? Like, what metric comes up and shows like, oh, look, we can see that it's so much more accurate. How do you see that?
So let me start from the theoretical point of view. There's just lots of, I think, theoretical issues with Myers-Briggs. For example, thinking versus feeling. That's incoherent, in my opinion. Thinking is not. It's not thinking or feeling. those are two different dimensions, and you can be high or low on either. So I think in terms of like the scales themselves, they're kind of illogical. They don't make sense from a personality perspective. In terms of what they actually capture, the introversion that's captured by Myers-Briggs is more inspired by Jung than by our current understanding of introversion. So they throw in a little bit more stuff about creativity, whereas Big Five creativity would be more related to openness to experience.
Quick question. Now, I'm trying to remember, wasn't kind of the idea of extroversion and introversion, didn't Jung basically either develop or kind of mainstream that?
I believe so, yeah. But like I said, his understanding of introversion versus extroversion is very different than our current most up-to-date understanding of what that actually represents. And our current understanding is that there may be a small correlation with how creative you are, that, you know, if you're kind of, I don't know, someone who likes being home alone rather than going out to parties, that you're more likely to be creative. Like there is some kind of weak correlation there, I think, but it's not as strong as Jung proposed. Whereas Jung, I don't think really differentiated those at all. He thought it was just kind of this one thing, whereas in reality, it's just this very weak correlation. So like those are the types of issues that I think Myers-Briggs suffers from.
Now, a few questions.
Yes.
So on, sorry, Jack, I just want to interject a few things. So the thinking versus feeling, one is it more problem with those labels? Because I mean, I do see like, okay, thinking versus feeling. Well, I do both. And like maybe those labels are a little bit holdovers, and it's really what the questions are asking now is representing something else. And I guess related to that also is the questions that are asked on Myers-Briggs. Have those developed over time where like maybe they had kind of a more Jungian focus or some other, whatever the theory is behind Myers-Briggs and its origination? Has it migrated in the types of questions that are asked on the test to be something that's almost more similar to the Big Five?
So to address those, I'm not sure, in all honesty, about the evolution of the test. I will say that the current introversion-extroversion axis does show lower correlations with the Big Five introversion-extroversion axis than the perceiving, judging, and conscientiousness, and the sensing, feeling, and, or excuse me, I keep doing this, sensing, intuition, and openness to experience.
Okay.
So I don't disagree with Jared on those two theoretical points. I think the thinking feeling axis is poorly named. And I think what you were striking at is fairly accurate, that it's not a fully accurate reflection of what it's meant to measure, but also I do think that it is somewhat incoherent overall, in that it is essentially just a lossy substitute for agreeableness. And I do think that our understanding of introversion and extroversion has evolved from Jung's time. Where I guess where I really get a bee in my bonnet about it is that personality psychologists act like this is all just some incoherent mess, and we came in and swept through all this incoherent nonsense and delivered the one true personality test. And my contention is very simply that the Big Five, in terms of actual practical impact, looks very much more like a moderate iteration of a very similar thing than it does looking like whole new truth sweeping in. And I think it's careless of them and really arrogant of them to act like everyone else was just spouting nonsense and that they're spouting something foundational and real and coherent, rather than saying, yes, our understanding was a bit shaky. We've evolved an understanding and our categories are a little more precise. Our questions are a little more targeted, and the results will be a little more useful overall. I think that's a much more realistic and a much more accurate view of the difference between the MBTI and the Big Five than this idea that the one is an incoherent mess and the other is a brilliant work of science.
Jared, your response?
Jack and I think we agree on a lot more than we don't. Like he does have a point that like there are correlations between Myers-Briggs and Big Five. And to deny those correlations is stupid. Like, it's empirical, it's there. We know this we know that there is correlations. We know that, like, Myers-Briggs is kind of like Jack says, kind of a lossy version of Big Five, that it captures some of it. It doesn't predict
Most
all
of
of
it.
I don't know. I'd like to know what the lift actually is. I'd like to know, like, if I know your Myers-Briggs, how accurately can I identify what percentile you are on each of the 5 dimensions? I would love to know that. And if someone had done a study about that, I would love to see it.
Jack, has your work, did you quantify that in some way?
I would say yes, that I did quantify it, and that it was answering a slightly different form. It was translating the less lossy way the Big Five is usually presented to the more lossy way the MBTI is usually presented. That is, it was transferring those scales to a binary. But I want to pause on that and say, because this touches on why I think the MBTI has captured more people's hearts in the popular world than the Big Five, which is that it is very, from a layperson's point of view, it is extremely coherent and it is extremely easy to understand. That is, when you get to the end of a test, you are told, this is how you are. These are your personality traits, this, and this. This is what you can expect. This is a whole set of things. This is your type. And the Big Five presents it in a much more scientific, rigorous, and to the layperson, incoherent way, which is, you're kind of high on this, you're kind of low on this. You can sort of expect to vaguely be sort of like this on this, very fuzzy on this. And it's so from a scientific point of view, it's less useful to have the presentation that the MBTI gives. But from a person who's just taking a personality test, trying to figure out, what can I learn about myself sort of thing, the MBTI's more straightforward presentation of results, I think, is very, very attractive. And because it is operating along very similar dimensions to the Big Five, it does, in fact, particularly if you're not towards the center on the dimensions, particularly if you're towards the edges, it does really nail a lot of things about you. And this is where a lot of people will disagree with me. But for example, when I look at the INTP section of the MBTI, and this is, I think, one reason I'm always really frustrated when people dismiss it out of hand, is when I look at the INTP section of it, it is so very clearly, unambiguously describing someone like me. There is no question that someone would look at that description and see something that describes someone like me more than most people. And there's a lot of fun and a lot of enjoyment. And yeah, this is how I am. This is the sort of thing I am. And it's not perfect, absolutely. But to act like you read that description and it's just chance that it happens to nail these peculiar traits of yours, I think is an oversight on the part of the psychologists.
So I was thinking it might be fun to so we've talked a little bit about, for Myers-Briggs, you guys, did you say you're INTP?
Yes.
Okay, INTP. And then what was I? I was ENTP, I believe. INFP. Yeah, INFP. So the way we took this test on our forum a while ago, and it gave like different labels for people, and they had these really funny graphics with it. But so my as INFPT, it was the mediator, and it's kind of like this hippie, going through the forest with flowers and butterflies, and no one can stop you from dreaming. I don't know if that one accurately describes me so much, but I got a kick out of that. So one member of our group was an ENTPA. And the graphic for it is your personality type is debater, and the little quote at the bottom. May I point out a couple of mistakes in your argument? And his comment on that was, "I'll see myself out." And I think we would probably all agree that one was probably what we would expect. Yeah. And then there was one who was also defender, which was ISFJA, and it's like a it's like a nurse. We are born not just for ourselves, and this person is very involved in advocacy and social justice and this type of thing. So there were some things that were not too surprising with that.
Yeah, to Jack's points, and I'll grant him this. The first time I took Myers-Briggs, I was blown away by how accurate it was. Which is also, by the way, the reaction that many people get when reading their astrology, but we'll leave that aside for now.
Well, many people get. Is it the reaction
accurate.
you get? Hold on. Is it the reaction you get when reading your astrology? Because you are not many people.
I don't know.
Okay.
What sign am I? I don't know. I can look that up. I think I'm a Pisces, right? I'll read it. But yeah, to Jack's point, and to this day, I read INTP and I'm like, oh yeah, that's me. And anyone in my family would read INTP and be like, oh yes, that is Jared to the T. And it's just very obvious. They paint a very clear picture of what this personality type is. And it's like, yeah, that's me. Big Five does not do that. All it says is like the defining thing of INTP is something like high engagement in intellectual endeavors, high in ideation, likes ideas. And what you would get if you took the Big Five is it just says you're high in openness to experience. And that does not capture my personality in the same way that saying I'm an INTP does, in terms of how I actually engage with ideas and the way that I think. And so it is one of those things where it does make me pause in my antagonism to Myers-Briggs because it is very accurate.
Yes.
It's funny. I don't feel quite like for other people. I see that for me, the Big Five is actually easier for me to grasp for myself. Now I like. I mean, maybe it's because I'm on kind of the borderline for
right.
Like 3 out of.
I think that's a big part of the reason.
So it's like, okay, yeah, I guess that kind of could describe me. And also, I guess I don't know, I can never remember what the different letters stand for, and also and when you were talking about the thinking versus feeling, it was also like, well, okay, but I mean, I do both very much. So
right.
Where with the Big Five, I guess, yeah, there's not as like a category, but when I look at it and the degrees of each of those 5 factors, I'm like, okay, yeah, that makes sense. I can wrap my head around that quite easily, but yeah, that probably does make sense since I'm borderline on a lot of those things.
Yeah. And I mean, at this point, I've spent enough time with both of them that I look at the Big Five and I'm like, yeah, this is useful, and it says a lot of accurate and important things about me very straightforwardly. It's just not usually, I would say, to a lay audience, the way the test is presented is very rarely going to give that same impression of immediate insight as something like the MBTI does, that impression of being known as something like the MBTI does. And I think it's important to wrestle with and to fully understand the flaws of tests like the MBTI and to understand definitely things like the Big Five are superior. But I think it's also important for the personality psychologists who are so convinced that all of these other tests are absolute rubbish, that have no reason anyone should ever look at them, to understand why people do, in fact, look at them, and that it is not a deficiency on the part of all of these people that is making them be fooled by hucksters selling nothing.
Yeah. Well, and a comparison that I might make again, that actually I think is favorable to MBTI. So if we were to look at the Ptolemaic versus Newtonian model of the solar system. So, or I guess we could say Ptolemaic versus Copernican, Keplerian, Newtonian. For a long time, the Ptolemaic system was very, very accurate, and even better than alternatives. Like, it was far superior in its predictions to the Copernican system. And so there's a lot of merit to the Ptolemaic system, where I think it's not a good comparison And where I think actually MBTI probably looks better is that the underlying assumptions of the Ptolemaic system were also much worse than in the Copernican, Keplerian, and Newtonian system, because it assumed the Earth was at the center of the solar system, which was just not correct, right?
Yes.
Whereas with now, understanding historically, there may have been some kind of weird assumptions going into Myers-Briggs, but I think, at least as I understand it, practice today, nobody really pays attention to those. At least I haven't. But
I don't really pay attention to those. People get really into it, and they will get really lost in the weeds there.
So there is that out there.
But so to leap off what you were saying, because I think what you're saying is really insightful, these different interpretations of the universe. I think one major thing to keep in mind with psychology, and I love psychology, I focus way more on it than I focus on the hard sciences. But when we're studying psychology, what we need to understand is that there are no constructs within it. There is nothing within it that is anywhere near as solid as our understanding of, say, does the Earth revolve around the sun? How do these fundamental physics structures of the universe? All of it is us sort of poking around the edges of this very fuzzy and very complicated system of how are human minds working, trying to grasp at the fundamental underlying reality. But all of the models that we are making of things like this are, and I absolutely include more scientific ones like the Big Five in this, are not fundamentally true the same way the Earth revolves around the sun is true. They are useful simplifications of a complicated, fuzzy thing that we don't fully understand. And to treat them as any more than useful simplifications of a complicated, fuzzy thing that we don't fully understand, I think is to do all of them and to do us a disservice.
Yeah, what do you think, Jared?
I believe I agree with that. There are correlations between Big Five and various areas of the brain. So like if you're high in conscientiousness, like your salience network is more active. And there's, sizes of the brain that are going to be different. But in a way that's not surprising. And I'm not sure that wouldn't be the case for any personality type, because so long as it's like a valid dimension, like it's going to be reflected in your brain somewhat. And even, So maybe I'm arguing myself out of it, because there are correlations. I don't know if there's a correlation between, TF dimension in Myers-Briggs to something in the brain, but there is a correlation between agreeableness and the brain. So that might be an argument that it is a little bit leaving the model space. But having said that, I still think I would agree with Jack that it is fundamentally a model. It's a simplification. These aren't like you said at the beginning, these aren't 5 modules in the brain, or like just knobs that you turn one way, that get turned one way more than the other. Like in a very real way, these are just models. This is not reality.
Okay. Is it all right if we move to a slightly different topic?
Yeah.
Okay.
I did want to bring up one more thing about why Myers-Briggs is so popular, which is that it is entirely positive.
You're moving into where I was going anyway. So
okay.
So go ahead and talk about that.
So no matter how you land on the Myers-Briggs, whether you're high in E or I, in N or S, T, F, P, or J, doesn't matter how you end up, it frames it in such a way that you are a special snowflake, and like everything about you is beautiful, and diversity, isn't it great, and all of that. Big Five is not that. And just about everyone, when they learn about the Big Five, feels that there is a positive pole and a negative pole for each of the 5 dimensions.
Yeah, which I mentioned earlier. I definitely do.
Yes. Yeah, it's very gratifying for me on the MBTI to be told, oh yes, you're perceiving, which means you're flexible and you don't need to stick to any one plan and you don't need to be told what to do and so forth. And then the big five just comes out and is very blunt and says, no, you're a disorganized mess who struggles with any sort of structure. I'm like, well, rude, but fair.
Yeah. So, well, obviously, I mean, that maybe hurts a little bit more, but is there, I guess, a problem with that? I mean, obviously, it seems like in academia and professional psychologists, we kind of prefer the big five, so we're okay with the evaluative measure. You mentioned, Jared, when we were talking about this, like, we feel like there shouldn't be values, right? It should be value neutral. And I guess it's interesting because being that the big five is kind of more favored in the sciences, like that it's also embracing this evaluation, which would almost seem like the classic narrative, like when if you go as a freshman to college, just like you drop all your values, they're all no absolutes, right? Which isn't necessarily true or accurate, but nevertheless, the idea is there, the narrative's there.
Yeah, the surface level, like, science is supposed to be value neutral. It's not supposed to say, hey, you're better than so and so. And also intuitively, like, our concept of what personality is not Todd is better on one dimension than Jared. It's Todd is different than Jared on one dimension. And Myers-Briggs does that. It says, hey, you two are just different. It's not that one of you is better than the other in any way. But big five, it just kind of feels like each of the dimensions, it is better to be higher or lower on each of the dimensions. Now, you can still be too high on any of the dimensions. Every one of the dimensions, if you're on the extremes, you're in the top 1%, you're probably going to be having problems with your life in some way. Maybe not conscientiousness. Conscientiousness is, I don't know. Maybe I don't know what that would be off the top of my head, but all
might
of the
depend
other
how it combines with other things, like if you're conscientious and disagreeable. I don't know if I'd like that.
Yeah, I mean, the classic too much conscientiousness would be, say, a bureaucrat in an incredibly inflexible system who has someone with a very human, complicated problem coming to them, and they say, sorry, the rules say this. The rules say, they completely disregard whatever the situation would require and just be like, no, look, here are the rules, just follow the rules and you'll be fine, which works fine until it doesn't, which works fine until you need a human exception to something like that.
I think I would argue that too high conscientiousness would actually be more like OCD than like the rule-following bureaucrat.
Oh. I think it could be both.
Oh, interesting.
I think it depends on the dimensions you're looking at within it.
It could be.
But I would say, like, neuroticism, I don't think you could say that people who are more artistic tend to be more neurotic also, tend to have more negative emotionality also, and I think there's some basis for that. So, but yeah, I don't think someone who is extremely low neuroticism will suffer for being extremely low neuroticism. And it's interesting because I want to argue both sides of this at once. I want to say, on the one hand, good things are good and bad things are bad. And I think sometimes there's this urge to act like everything is equal, every trait is equal, everyone is equal, when they're not. On the other hand, I think things can be surprisingly useful in surprising circumstances. And it's tricky to weave the balance between those. But, an example of sort of the extreme of one end that I'm talking about is, I was listening to a podcast recently where they were talking about people who had lost an arm, and they kept using the phrase, yes, people with limb differences. And I just think that's such a self-deceiving phrase, because yes, you have lost an arm, and that is a bad thing, and it is okay to say you have lost an arm. You don't need to hide it in the phrase limb difference. I think that's an extreme of that example of trying to act like there are no value differences between different states that people have. That yes, there are value differences. That said, I would say, and maybe this is just coping, going back to my low conscientiousness, But I would say there are circumstances in which I have identified that it does give me a very clear advantage to not be super obsessed with order and organization and so forth. That when things get chaotic and when unexpected things spring up and when things really diverge from plan, I'm like, this is great. This is awesome. So like when I went on a 8-hour hike once that turned into a surprise 17-hour hike that ended at 4 a.m., I was having a blast the whole time. I was absolutely in my element at every new twist. I was like, this is hilarious. This will make a great story. Whereas some people who are much more suited to an orderly, structured, focused environment, they were miserable. They were depressed. They were horrified. Like my fiance is much higher in conscientiousness than I am. And he has this very rigid order to his day that he really is not thrilled when he has to deviate from. And he can't adapt to a ton of different environments very happily. Whereas for me, I can just like slot myself into that rigid order of his life and be like, yeah, this is fine for me. I have no problem with this. Or I can slot myself into any number of different circumstances and say, sure, I can cope with this. I can handle this. And I don't think it makes up for if I could trade that for a degree of being able to actually get things done, I don't think having that makes up for not being able to get a lot of things done that I want to get done. But I do think that it's not inaccurate to point out that there are advantages hidden in the disadvantages a lot of times.
That's a good point. Yeah, I appreciate you bringing that up. Yeah, it's got me thinking more about what are some of the benefits.
Out of curiosity, is your fiance, where does he rate on openness to experience?
He's high on openness to experience. Not like off the scales, but he's fairly high on openness to experience. And yeah, that is an important point, is that I have extremely high openness to experience combined with extremely low conscientiousness. I'm a very, very far outlier on both domains, which leads to, odd outcomes.
Yeah. I was looking at the comparison chart that we did with our big five, and I was a little embarrassed. Well, so like as I was thinking about all these, I was like, yeah, neuroticism really doesn't have any redeeming qualities. And then I was going back and looking at my results. I was like, oh shoot, I guess I have some of those. But I mean that relates to another topic. And what I was saying with the comparison is that everyone else seems to be pretty low on that. But the thing is, like, okay, so like anxiety was one that anxiety mostly, some depression tendencies, but it's also not like I just let things be that way, right? I was like, oh, too bad, I have this tendency to be anxious sometimes, and I'm just going to be anxious. As no, I do things to address that, right, and try to improve my quality of life. So two things there is like, I mean, kind of knowing those things helps to, I guess, address them. And then also, I do think it is possible to change in certain ways, like maybe not the underlying tendencies, but at least to behave in different ways. But and that gets into one more topic that I wanted to get to, was like the consistency of all of this.
Yes.
How much people stay the same over their lifetime. How often is it that people can actually break out of their tendencies? So anyway, any of you know about that or looked into that?
Sure. Yeah. So the easiest example is that conscientiousness tends to rise as someone gets older. So the older someone gets, on average, the more conscientiousness they will reflect. And that's one fairly regular trait that we can look at and say, yeah, there's a clear change here. In terms of therapy, different forms of therapy have minor to middling effects. So I think when I looked into it, it was like something like 3 months of talk therapy on conscientiousness might move you 1/3 of a standard deviation. That is, if you were worse than, if you were, say, average conscientiousness, it might bump you up to like 55th percentile conscientiousness instead of 50th percentile. That is, it nudges you, it will not dramatically shift you. And in general, that's my understanding for most of the traits, is that you can express them differently in different environments. You can put yourself in different environments such that you will be forced into different pathways, and you can shift the underlying reality marginally, and it will shift as you age. But dramatic shifts and fundamental shifts are very difficult. Things like psychedelics can raise your openness to experience fairly reliably. So that's one example of what does seem to be a deeper underlying shift. But yes, overall, they're fairly stable. You can see some shifts, you can see some things that change them, but they're fairly stable.
Yeah. And what about
with you, Jared?
Oh, I was just going to ask that, like, medications like antidepressants and things like that.
I'm not sure about antidepressants and such.
Yeah, I'm actually not sure. But I think everything Jack said was right. Conscientiousness, it raises over your lifetime. I believe openness to experience also increases as you age, though not as much. I think openness to experience is the most reliably genetic, as in it's the one that is best predicted by your parents, how your parents are, even like, in twin studies.
Which one was that? You said openness?
Openness to experience.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
I would have guessed neuroticism.
Yeah. Well, and it is interesting that probably the intervention we know that is best able to shift your personality is psychedelics on openness to experience. The psychedelics can increase your openness to, like, I think it's shrooms in particular, or maybe LSD, I can't remember, are really good and can shift your personality quite dramatically. And so it's interesting that's kind of it's interesting that it's the one that's best that is most inherited, that is the one we best know how to influence.
Yeah. In a way that kind of makes sense though, right? Because inheritance is, it's all chemical, but things that would be very evidently genetic might be at a more, I guess, have a simpler underlying chemistry, I guess, right? If something's a very complex chemistry, trying to change it chemically could be quite difficult.
Scott Alexander makes a really good point that oftentimes changing biology is a lot easier than changing social systems.
Oh yeah. You just think of like eyesight, right? Eyesight, I'm assuming is genetic, among other things. But yeah, it's not that hard to repair. We've been able to do that for hundreds of years.
Yeah, the example he gives is of lead poisoning, where the evidence is kind of shaky. I don't really know how it ends up, but it looks like part of the crime wave, or the decrease in crime that we've had since the 80s, is that we have less lead in everywhere, but specifically in our gasoline, and that decreasing gasoline has what lead does in the brain is it basically makes you a little bit more violent, a little bit less conscientious, perhaps a little bit more impulsive, which is basically, conscientiousness is basically not being impulsive in many ways.
Right.
And so that's basically a biological intervention, is, hey, we took lead away, and hopefully that is what we think, that's what made the crime go away or decrease from what it was. And that's a lot easier intervention than trying to figure out, okay, here we have this neighborhood full of crime, like, what do we do socially to try and solve this problem? Because that's really hard. But if all you have to do is take away the lead, that's a very easy intervention. And cool. I think something similar goes on with personality, where a lot of our traits are actually better described as habits, in a way, where it's just, you have a pattern that you, in a certain context with certain cues, you behave a certain way because that's your habit. And changing habits is really hard. And if it were just this biological thing, like, you might be able to adjust it, but habits end up being very ingrained and are particular to a situation, and that makes them a little bit more difficult to change.
Okay, back from our little Zoom break there. So Jared, I think you had a few other topics you wanted to touch on. I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, I wanted to point out that there is a third theory or approach to personality developed by Michel. Michel is a name you might remember. He's famous for the marshmallow experiment.
Oh, okay.
And the popular version of the marshmallow experiment is something like you put a marshmallow in front of a kid and you say, hey, if you can wait 10 minutes, you can have a second marshmallow, or you can have it now. And then the researcher, the adult, leaves the room, and then the kid has to sit there and try to not eat the marshmallow for 10 minutes. And lots of the kids end up eating the marshmallow because they haven't quite developed enough conscientiousness. They don't quite have the impulse control.
Mm-hmm.
And some follow-up experiments showed, or reportedly showed, that kids who did worse on the marshmallow test years later did worse in school, did worse in college, did worse and had lower income. Whereas those kids who were able to, just handle their temptations, they ended up being more successful in life. Now, there's a whole bunch of methodological issues around that, including they didn't really control for income in the original experiments. There are some issues, but it still seems like it's true that to some degree
the core finding holds.
Yeah. However, Michel approaches that very differently. For him, that is not at all about personality, which a lot of researchers have interpreted that as personality because, hey, it's stable across your whole lifetime. What you do as a kid, that's what you do as an adult. But Michel does not see it that way at all. He sees it as a skill that you develop. And in all of his original experiments, what he was doing was he was actually trying to figure out what are these, the kids that are able to do it successfully, what is it that they're doing differently? So for example, he would have the kids say while I'm gone, imagine that there's a picture frame around the marshmallow. So you're just imagining it. Imagine that it's just a picture of a marshmallow. And when kids did that, they were better able to resist the temptation. And you'd ask them, be like, "Oh, why didn't you eat the marshmallow?" It's like, "Oh, yeah, well, you don't need a picture. Pictures aren't tasty." And so, for Michel, these kids were kind of developing skills, and some of these kids had the skills. And the thing about skills is you have them for your lifetime. You develop it once and you keep it. And so there is that consistency where if you had it as a kid, you're going to have it as an adult. But that doesn't necessarily mean that if you don't have it as a kid, you won't have it as an adult. Oh. So Michel is very critical of personality research in general. There's good YouTube videos and good articles on it, and he wrote a book back in the 70s, I think, where he was just very critical. And he pointed out how inconsistent people actually are. Because if you think about it, there are some situations in which you are more risk-taking than you are in other situations. You can think of experiences or times that you were more extroverted and times that you were more introverted. And what you are capable of is actually very varied. And Michel, I think, very successfully showed and ended up winning the debate around personality, showing that personality is better predictive of within context over time than personality is predictive of across all contexts. Because across all contexts, you vary quite a bit. But within a specific context, say, parties, you may be introverted to every party you go to across time, but that doesn't mean you'll be introverted across all situations.
I have a few comments in response to that. First off, I have a brief story of my own marshmallow experiment experience, which happened when I went to church sometime as a teenager. The teacher thought, it would be a good object lesson. I'll give people a piece of candy at the start of class, and then if they make it to the end without eating it, I'll bring them a bigger one next week. And, this will be a great object lesson on conscientiousness. And I was like, screw your objects lesson, screw you, I'm just eating the small piece of candy just to make a point. And so I ate the small piece of candy, and I was very satisfied with my small piece of candy, and I still think I won that exchange. More directly to Michel's point, I think essentially everything is a skill. You cannot point to a human trait that it's very, very difficult to point to a human trait that cannot be improved in some way with focused practice. One of my favorite examples of this is eye degeneration in old age. Even as the muscles are degrading, even as your eyes are declining, there were some researchers who had people do these exercises in reading small text over a long period of time. And by the end, even though the physical decline wasn't able to be stopped, they had trained sufficiently that they were still, the ones who had trained were still much more capable in reading that small text than the ones who hadn't trained. That's an example of a trait that most people assume to be just, what are you going to do about it? It's just inborn. That can have training effects. And I think it's perfectly sensible to say that personality has the same factors in. Number two, I agree that there's an environmental factor. And I think anyone who's been on a Mormon mission knows this immediately and intuitively, because someone's behavior on a Mormon mission is very, very different to their behavior in regular life. And no matter how introverted they are, they're going to be a lot more outgoing on their mission. No matter how unconscientious they are, they're going to be a lot more organized and structured on their mission. No matter how disagreeable they are, they're going to need to be friendly to an extent on their mission. That said, I think it's deceptive a little bit to focus on it like that, in that someone who starts from a higher point on all of those will then go out on a Mormon mission and be that much more conscientious and that much more agreeable and that much more extroverted. That still, relative to the other people there, you can make a hierarchy of all missionaries by those traits, and there will still be some who excel on those traits compared to the others. And you take the rank ordering of, say, a bunch of unemployed stay-at-home NEETs, as they're called, not in education, employment, or training, and you compare them to each other, and you take a bunch of Mormon missionaries and you compare them to each other, then say you take all those NEETs and send them on Mormon missions, I think you would find essentially the same rank ordering in all of those traits, with maybe some differences as some people come into their element and some people focus harder within some of it, whatever. But you would see essentially that same rank ordering preserved, I think, where people can train, but the inherent personality traits and environmental context can change things, but the inherent personality traits will still have a significant impact and will determine how difficult it is to train to a certain level, how much you have to push against which natural inclinations, how much you can adapt to any given environment, so forth. So I think what he says has a point, and I think there's value in it. But at the same time, I think it's possible to take it too far simply because we always hope that we are so much more adaptable to things than often we turn out to be. And I want to be cautious about giving people false hope.
Fair enough. It kind of goes back to what I was saying about habits, which is you develop habits in certain contexts, and those habits are very hard to change. And if you grew up being an extroverted person, then you're developing these extroverted habits, and those are going to be hard to change in case you wanted to be more introverted for whatever reason. And yeah, changing who you've been for your whole life, like that's going to be really difficult. But at the same time, like you enter new contexts and you can develop these new habits. And in a certain context, you could be very extroverted. Like there's certain situations in which I'm very extroverted, whereas normally I'm pretty introverted. And it just really depends a lot on the context and how I approach those contexts to begin with. And I just have habits, certain ways of being, certain cues that I react to that trigger how I'm going to act in any given situation. But how much conscious control we have over developing that over any given situation, that's I'm not entirely clear on that.
The conscious control point is an interesting one because I was thinking, how much does just reflecting on something like this have to do with it? Like if you're looking at the way somebody changes or doesn't change over time, and you're just observing them without interfering at all with the system. Versus if you tell somebody, "Hey, I'm watching your conscientiousness, and by the way, conscientiousness pays off in this way and this way and that way," and then all of a sudden the person's thinking about it's like, "Oh yeah, actually, I could benefit from a little bit more conscientiousness." I could see that interfering in the system in that way could have more of an impact.
I would say with things like that, a lot of times my prediction would be temporary increase followed by regression to the mean.
Yeah, that's probably a realistic prediction.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely going to be regression to the mean. And I think that's what the research supports, that you can change personality temporarily.
Mm-hmm.
But
Yeah.
you get regression to the mean at some point. But there is something to be said for, like, you can develop habits and you can develop skills in any given context. Like, you may be pretty risk averse, but you could learn rock climbing and get very comfortable at rock climbing. And then everyone else is going to think you're some kind of risk taker because you do rock climbing. But in every other context, you're not a risk taker. It's just because you developed, like, you took the time, you took the effort, you were very deliberate about it, and you trained for this one specific situation to increase your seeming risk taking for that particular situation.
I would say, yeah, I come to a similar conclusion in the end, but I prefer approaching it from a different angle. And in my opinion, of course it would be, my angle is better than his, which is assume that you cannot change. Assume that your personality is absolutely fixed. How can you get to where you want to be anyway? Assuming that whatever negative traits you have, you are going to have those negative traits forever. Look and say, well, what environments can I place myself within? What contexts can I place myself within where I can minimize the impact of those traits and maximize the impact of my positive traits? And if I change those negative things, if these things that I wish I could change do happen to change along the way as I'm striving towards where I want to be, fantastic. But I'm going to go in assuming that I am fixed in these dimensions, but that I still have aspirations that defy who I am. And I want to see how close I can get to those aspirations, whether or not I end up on any sort of fundamental level changing. And hopefully I will fundamentally change. But
you could perhaps combine our two approaches, because we're both talking about controlling the context. We're just talking about it for different reasons. You're saying control the context to minimize failures, and I'm saying control the context so you can maximize skill within that one particular context. So you might be able to use both of our approaches to your benefit there.
Yeah, ultimately the message is, for me, that you have much more control over your context than you do over internal. I would say it's useful to approach things as, how do I control my context versus how do I control the internals? It's useful to say,
whether it's true or not. But
right, what circumstances should I put myself in? How can I force myself to be who I want to be through external measures? I think is a more useful way than saying maybe I'll have willpower this time.
Right. Yeah. Well, and that's actually, so, like, I guess I'll go ahead and say I do kind of, I prefer the Big Five framework for my own I guess reflection and development. But so, and I point out to you, like, oh, I definitely have value judgments along these lines. But that doesn't mean that's not because I'm maxed out on where I want to be maxed out. I'm not, I could see, like, oh, I could definitely benefit being higher in this than I am. Or now that reflecting on what you're talking about here is kind of interesting. It's like, okay, well, knowing where I'm at, how can I work with that to do the things that I want to, to do the things that I want to do in my life and to meet the goals that I want to meet.
Yeah. And I think that's one reason I like realism about these things. And I do resist saying all of these traits are equal. And I think the value judgments are useful in the Big Five. It's useful for me to know, in terms of conscientiousness, that most people around will be more organized and more focused and more orderly than me. That is very useful information for me to manage my life and say, how can I reach past that? How can I achieve goals that require those things anyway? And I think when you start stripping those value judgments away and you start acting like, oh, there's no disadvantage inherent in this, you put yourself at a disadvantage by refusing to acknowledge the disadvantage that will not go away by you closing your eyes and wishing it would.
There was a funny line in this course I listened to on personality where saying there's kind of a common phrase like, well, it takes all types, it takes all kinds when you run across somebody who's does something weird or annoying, and you say, well, whether or not it takes all kinds, they're all here anyway. So we kind of just got to make the best of it.
I think that's a more realistic and a more useful approach to it. Doesn't take all types. Some people are better at almost all things than other people. Unfortunate, but true. But we're all here, so let's figure out
let's make the best of it.
Ourselves anyway.
And having this type of information, this analysis is good for that,
Yes, we're all here. None of us have achieved perfection on all domains or realistically any domains. Mm-hmm. And we're all so far from it that there are ways in which focusing on the differences and the ways in which we're better than others is meaningless and a counterproductive exercise. But ultimately, everyone has to work with what they've got, and we all have to work with what everyone's got. So let's figure out how we can become extraordinary anyway. I think is a good approach.
I'll build a little bit on what Jack was saying earlier, because my professional background is behavior change. I'm not, personality is pet interest. I'm kind of uncomfortable talking about it in some ways because I feel like I'm going to share it on Facebook or whatever. And, former professors are going to be like, Jared, didn't you know better? I taught you better than this.
As they should.
But on behavior change, that is what I have my master's in. It's what I do professionally. And so I feel more comfortable talking about it, and then what Jack said about trying to control your context, not trying to build up the willpower or change who you are internally. That's essentially what it comes down to. And in fact, people who are high in conscientiousness, who have good impulse control, what they do is they're not working up willpower to resist temptation. Conscientious people are actually better at avoiding temptation in the first place. They avoid those situations in which they would have to exert willpower. So context is king. And that is one of the biggest lessons from behavioral science and the science of behavior changes. You control the context, that is ultimately what decides your behavior. Now, that's not to say that you can't develop some skills. For example, a pre-mortem is a particular technique you can do to help you better achieve your goals. And it works, it's helpful. People should do that. And that's a skill you can develop. But ultimately, even pre-mortem, which is where you kind of predict ways that you might fail. The way pre-mortem works is by controlling your context to prevent those failures. So context is king. And then one more thing I wanted to say was, you have personalities and you can conceptualize them as strengths and weaknesses. But as we were talking about earlier, being too high on a personality trait is also bad. People who are high in extroversion get in more car accidents, for example. And being too high in conscientiousness is probably a bit like OCD, if not OCD itself. So each of these, you can be too high, and there can be a strength to being somewhere lower on the scale. And there's a good argument to be made that the reason that personality exists on a distribution is because sometime in our evolutionary past, every point on that distribution has been useful. If it wasn't useful, we would have developed to be more consistent in our personality traits, but that was not adaptive. We evolved to have variation in our personality. So that must mean that there are some advantages to being lower in, for example, conscientiousness and higher in neuroticism. Apparently that's adaptive in some way. I think that's true. I'm not 100% positive, but I think that's true. So, our weaknesses can be made strong in a sense.
Mm-hmm. Jack, did you have a comment?
I will resist the temptation to quibble with some elements of that. I think overall it's an accurate and a useful message.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I guess this might be related to what you were thinking, but one thing is like, I think especially with evolutionary origins for things, it's possible like some of those contexts aren't around anymore. Where like you're a hunter-gatherer setting versus an urban setting, office setting, but there may be analogs that could be rerouted and adapted in certain ways. But
yeah, absolutely. I think being low in conscientiousness is basically kind of like ADHD in some ways, and being ADHD means you're kind of looking around. You might notice lions or something like that. There is a reason that like it would have been adaptive in that context. But if you're sitting in school trying to study, then being low in conscientiousness just sucks and it's maladaptive, and there's basically no good reason. Like maybe we should adjust our school system to adapt to how we actually are, or maybe we pump kids with Ritalin or whatever to actually focus and whatever.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Well, I think we touched on all the things that I had on my list. Any other topics or points to address?
I think that's it.
That's cool. It for me.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, guys, for coming on. I really enjoyed this conversation and the topic. So I'm glad that you both have been talking about it and can give me some insights and education on this. So very cool. Well, I'll see you later.
All right. Take care.